just recently moved to the area and I had to go into St. James's Business Centre, and when I walked in I saw that there was a great big painting on the wall of a Hillman Imp. I didn't really understand why there is a big painting of an old British economy car on their wall, and then I looked up the stairs and there's another one up there as well. So I was a bit curious about why this was. So I started to do a bit of research on the situation, and I found out that Hillman Imps, through their entire production, were made in Linwood. And not just in Linwood, but right here where I'm standing right now used to be the production line for Hillman Imps. So I thought, what the hell happened to it? Why is there not a massive factory here pumping out cars nowadays? And why is there a firefighter training company right there and a TNT supply depot over there? It didn't really make sense to me. So I did even more research and I started to look into the story behind the factory. And the story is honestly really fascinating. And I just thought I needed to share it with you guys. So I've just made this video just to share some of the amazing story behind what used to be here. My loyal viewers will probably have noticed that in that clip I look quite a bit different than I did in my last video, and that's because I shot it 4 years ago. This was meant to be my first video for this channel, but at the time I didn't really understand how massive a story this is and how much work this video would be, so it got put to the side while other videos took priority. Now after 4 years I'm finally ready to tell this incredible story, so let's jump into the story of the Linwood factory and the Hillman Imp. The story starts in a pretty unexpected place and time, but bear with me, it'll all make sense in the end.
Do you think it's time that we use force in the Middle East?
Well, I don't exactly like the idea of that, no. If they can settle it by other means, which, it looks complicated to me.
So as this guy put it all the way back in the 50s, the whole situation is pretty complicated, but the story of Linwood is linked at its roots to the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, and hopefully you'll see why in a minute, but for now just bear with me. Okay, I'm going to try and speed through this, so don't have a go at me if it's not the most detailed analysis of the whole situation you've ever heard. If you want to find out more, there's a ton of great videos on YouTube explaining it. I should know because I've watched most of them. The Suez Canal is a pretty important piece of land in global politics and logistics, especially to the British. In fact, I'd argue it's the most important canal in the entire world. The creation of the canal in 1869 by Ferdinand de Lesseps revolutionised global logistics. It meant that any cargo travelling from the east, for example from India or China, no longer needed to navigate all the way around Africa to get to Europe. It literally cut the journey distance almost in half. It's the same idea as the Panama Canal in Central America for all you Yanks watching. In fact, Ferdinand was the same guy who worked on the Panama Canal. He never finished it, but that's another story, and I'm already off on a tangent here. After the Second World War, Britain had control over the Suez Canal, with several military bases stationed there, and British-owned companies overseeing the day-to-day business of ferrying cargo through. In fact, 80% of all ships that used the canal at the time were British. So it was a bit of a big deal when this guy, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the new president of Egypt, announced in 1956 that he's going to nationalise the canal to give the profits back to the Egyptian government. Now there's a lot more to it than that, like there was a promise to build a dam and the Russians got involved because of the whole Cold War thing, but I'm trying to keep this simple, so yeah. Of course this didn't go down too well over in the UK, and along with France and Israel they invaded, and it was all just kind of a cock-up. I mean, the invasion went fine, the British are pretty good at invading things, but the international backlash was not great. Extremely long story short, the British government got embarrassed and along with Israel and France they withdrew, leaving the UN in charge. Somehow even the Americans thought the British invasion was a terrible idea and strongly condemned their actions.
On Sunday, the Israeli government ordered total mobilization. On Monday, their armed forces penetrated deeply into Egypt and to the vicinity of the Suez Canal, nearly 100 miles away. And on Tuesday, the British and French governments delivered a 12-hour ultimatum to Israel and Egypt, now followed up by armed attack against Egypt. The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
Yeah, that really didn't age well. Anyway, to cut a long and complicated story short, the Egyptians got what they wanted, and the British had to relinquish control of the canal. Not only did this make the once fierce and all-powerful British Empire look like a bit of a joke, but it also left the UK in a terrible economic situation, and more importantly for our story, fuel shortages became a major issue. If this whole story sounds weirdly familiar, it's probably because in 2021 there was another Suez Canal crisis, but instead of a war, some idiot just crashed a bloody container ship in it. A bit different, but the interruption to global logistics was very similar, but not quite as severe or prolonged. Back to the 50s, fuel shortages were becoming such an issue that the government actually implemented fuel rationing for a while. There was even this newsreel which encouraged people to find an alternative to using their cars.
Every vehicle on the road depends on oil in one form or another. Private motorists can help by exercising restraint over and above the limitations imposed by petrol rationing. Here's a suggestion. Don't drive those 200 miles a month. Instead, save petrol and keep fit the natural way. Let eager business types become pedal pushers. If you're a top executive, travel in style. Seriously, however, public transport, in spite of cuts, can still absorb a lot of private travel. There must be thousands who could use it instead of their private car during this real emergency. The transport of oil to this country is a long haul, and every tanker's cargo is more vital than ever. Its careful distribution and allocation is obviously a priority. Its allocation? Well, it goes without saying that the most urgent need is to keep the wheels of industry turning.
The idea of economy cars had never really taken off in the UK before this. There was never really a need for them. But now, everyone and their mum needed an economy car like never before. Obviously, every car company in the UK saw this massive demand, and it had them frantically trying to develop a new low-cost and fuel-efficient car. This time period is where we see some of the most iconic small British cars, like the Mini Cooper, being created, and the major shift in design ethos of car manufacturers away from big is better to small and cheap. One company of particular interest to us, the Rootes Group, were hit particularly hard by this situation, as most of their cars they had for sale were big, heavy, luxurious, and not fuel efficient. The Rootes Group, just like everyone else, began a rather rushed development of what they called Project Apex. Unless you're really into British cars, you've probably never heard of the Rootes Group, but in the 20th century they were a massive player in the British automotive scene. The Rootes Group was founded by two brothers, William and Reginald Rootes, in 1917. They started out as a car distribution company selling all over the UK. By 1924, the brothers had become the largest seller of trucks and cars nationwide. They sold models ranging from Fiats to Rolls-Royces in their showrooms across the UK. In 1928, the brothers decided to move into the car manufacturing business and bought out a familiar name, Hillman. From the 20s to the 60s, they expanded their business by acquiring several car manufacturers, most notably Humber, Sunbeam, Singer, not the Porsche builders by the same name, Talbot, Comer, and Carrier. Some of these names will be pretty important later on, but for now let's stay focused on Hillman. In 1938, Hillman decided they wanted a small car to fill a gap in their lineup, and they created what many consider to be the Imp's grandfather, Little Jimmy. Little Jimmy was a front-engine rear-wheel drive car that was considered a very conventional design for its time, unlike its offspring. It was small and apparently sported a flathead 4-cylinder 750cc engine. It didn't survive long, however. When World War II began in 1939, the project was axed so that Rootes could focus on the war effort. In 1955, the Rootes Group, thanks to the Suez Canal crisis, was again in need of a small economical car. This project was nicknamed the Slug, the grandfather of the Imp. The Slug was the brainchild of Michael Parks and Tim Fry. These names might not mean a lot to most people, but Mike went on to race for Ferrari in Formula 1 a few years after the completion of the Imp, and Tim went on to become the chief engineer for Rootes, so it's an understatement to say they knew what they were doing. These guys absolutely loved to race, and to illustrate this point, these last two pictures are Mike and Tim racing a pair of Imps on their debut. The main design goals for the Slug were to have a car that was small, cheap, able to achieve 60 miles per hour and 60 miles per gallon, and could fit 2 adults and 2 children. However, the final goal was that it had to be a fun car to drive, and none of the other goals should get in the way of that. What they ended up with was a revolutionary design, but it wasn't exactly a looker. Apparently William Rootes refused to even step inside the thing. The engine was rear mounted and the body designed with aerodynamics in mind, which although sounds pretty basic by today's standards, cars back then were designed to have the same aerodynamic efficiency as a brick. Sadly for all our aerodynamicists out there, but gladly for the rest of us who have eyes, the slick aerodynamic stylings were replaced with a more conventional design. Usually I'm a function over form kind of guy, but even I've got to admit they made the right choice here. The British public just weren't ready for an oversized Isetta bubble car. In my research for this video I came across this excellent TV show from the BBC called The Car is the Star, and in one episode they covered the Hillman Imp and its story. The best bit about the show was they managed to get interviews with some of the actual employees that worked at Linwood. Even better than that, there's an interview with Tim Fry himself. I'm going to let him explain a little bit more about the design process of the Slug.
Well, Mike Parks and I were very good friends, so we went to the Director of Engineering, B.B. Winter, and said to him, we could design you just the car we want. And he said, all right, get on with it then. The car became known as the Slug, presumably from its appearance, but it didn't get a proper code name till much later on. With the high cost of constant velocity universal joints, front-wheel drive was out of the question, and that actually having a rear engine was the most economical layout at the time. The Mini had set a new niche in the market, and it was the same niche that we were trying to fill.
As Tim points out in the interview, after designing the original Slug prototype, the top brass at Rootes decided to take the Slug from prototype to production. They called this Project Apex, father of the Imp. A quite interesting thing that Tim said is that they were well aware that they were competing head-to-head with the Mini. Despite this, they went about the design completely differently, the Mini being a more experimental, at the time, front-engine, front-wheel drive design, and the Imp being a rear-engined and rear-wheel drive design. The rear-engine design was cheaper to manufacture, but it had an unintentional consequence which I'll let Tim explain.
We had a lot of luggage capacity in the front, but people expect to put luggage in the back of a car. We came up with the idea of having the rear window opening so you could put luggage in through there, and I suppose it was the start of a hatchback, really.
Another source I'm going to rely on heavily in this project is a short film produced for the Rootes Group back in 1963 as a sort of promotional video. It's obviously quite biased as it was made by Rootes themselves, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. For now, let's hear what they have to say about the design of the Imp.
The planning of a completely new machine is a challenge to human ingenuity, inventiveness, and experience. Details of advanced design are worked out for management consideration. A car has to accommodate the human body. 4 human bodies, in fact. And of course the engine. And if the engine goes there, it leaves more room for people in a small car. Independent suspension, of course, and at both ends for a smooth, comfortable ride. Box-shaped for strength. Tilt the engine to save space. Wrap the whole thing in a tidy shape, and it begins to look like a real car.
As this clip points out, the Imp had independent suspension, which for those of you who aren't massive car design nerds like myself, was a pretty big deal at the time. Independent suspension is still to this day considered a must for a good handling car, and pretty much every performance car has it. I'm looking at you, Ford Mustang. It's also not used in a lot of modern economy cars. For example, my car, a 2008 Volkswagen Polo, which only has independent suspension on the front. It's pretty incredible that in the 1960s they were able to design and produce an economy car with all-round independent suspension. It wasn't just the suspension that was impressive, the car had quite a few innovative designs on it, such as an automatic choke, something which is not an issue today due to fuel injection, but back in the day of carburetors this was great forward thinking. It also had something called a pneumatic throttle, which, despite being a mechanic for 10 years, I still can't really comprehend. Like, I understand how it works, I just don't understand why they did it. But it was innovative, that's for sure. Another thing I want to talk about, because it's really quite important later in the story, is the beating heart of the Imp, the engine. The engine design was purchased from a company called Coventry Climax, which sounds more like this name of a CD VHS title from the adult section to me, but they made pretty good engines. The engine that the Roots Group purchased was initially designed for the government as a water pump, but through development they found it was actually a pretty stout little race engine if tuned right. Again, it was a design well ahead of its time, with an all-aluminium construction and an overhead camshaft, both things that are again common in the modern age, but far from it 60 years ago.
Aluminium, amongst the most exciting metals of our day, is one of the secrets of the Imp's reliability and vivid performance. Aluminium engine parts are made by Roots at Linwood by high-pressure die casting. Die casting means faster production and bypasses the need for lengthy machining, and every single piece is rigorously examined for perfection before passing to the next stage.
Little side note here, Coventry Climax actually crafted two of these engines together into a 1.5 litre V8, which was then fitted to Jim Clark's Formula 1 championship winning Lotus 25, so to say it had racing success is an understatement. This engine design piqued the interest of Tim Fry, who wrote to Coventry Climax and requested the technical drawings to see if he could make it fit into the Imp chassis. Not only did they manage to fit the engine in, but they also increased the size from 750cc to 875cc, producing a massive 39 horsepower. Now that last bit was sarcasm, but for a car as lightweight as the Imp, 39 horsepower was plenty. Finally, a car was starting to appear from all these components, and it was time to start testing.
In the rig test shops, individual components are given a lifetime of strain in a few months. Even details like trafficator switches have to be fit for brutal use or even misuse. The gear change lever operates endlessly. Rubber universal joints are made to last. And on this rig, the suspension goes through a worse time than it will ever get anywhere on any road. And now the whole car must be tested in what the engineers laughingly call realistic conditions. Endless high-speed thrashing is only the beginning of the course at the test grounds. Then it is thrown madly about in any number of ways to prove its safety.
The testing was not only brutal, but it was worldwide. The Imp was tested in France, Belgium, Italy, Austria, Spain, Canada, America, Norway, Kenya, and even the Arctic Circle.
And now for the long-distance work on every kind of road. Through France. France has its killer roads, old military tracks through mountainous country. And on these roads, one slip could be the last slip. On to Italy. On an autostrada, a car can be driven fast and hard for long periods. Constant checks are kept on fuel and oil consumption and on engine performance. It's easy to find sub-zero conditions in the Dolomites, but through mile after mile of soft snow and hard snow, the Imp skims along without faltering. And on through Austria to Belgium, top speeds and top reliability for touring. And over to Africa, where the test drivers choose conditions that a city motorist would find a shade disconcerting. And the Imp has emerged as a car equally suitable for jaunts or jungles. All the components are checked in tests from America to Africa, from Canada to Kenya. This car must keep going in every kind of climate and terrain, through the heat of the tropics or into the everlasting cold in the Arctic, where 40 degrees below is normal and accepted. The car of today roars into a land of legend towards the latitude of endless night. For some motorists, this is the only kind of world their cars will ever know. In the far north of Sweden, under conditions like these, a car must have reliability.
Now, despite how the Roots Group film makes it sound, this testing often wasn't as, let's say, professional as they make it out to be. As this interview clip from the BBC's The Car is the Star with Richard Lovey, a former Roots employee, explains.
You can imagine what it was like with a group of people aged 18, 21, something like that, being given prototype cars and asked to drive them together, but not do anything silly, and just to put miles on them to see what would happen to the cars. Were they going to be reliable? Was anything going to drop off? What were going to be some of the difficulties of the owner-driver? We tended to drive as you might expect a group of people of that age group to drive. We very much enjoyed it, and we tended to drive very often as a group. And so sometimes you would find that the 6 or 8 cars would be going along together, as if tied together with a piece of string. And when we did this after dark, the front chap would have his headlamps on, and the chap at the back would have his lights on, and the blokes in the middle didn't. But we could see what was happening from the people in front of us. There was one particular chap who first of all managed to run into a steamroller, which we thought was pretty good because they're very fast-moving objects, and the second thing he hit was a truck full of railway sleepers. After that, he was taken off the driving.
This is a sign of things to come, where it appears that there was no expense spared. However, in reality, corners were cut. Okay, so Project Apex was reaching the point of production. The Imp was finally here after the years of prototypes and projects. The Roots Group was ready to start rolling these things out, but of course, they needed a factory to do that. We're going to jump back in time a little bit and see the challenges Roots had to overcome to get this thing from prototype to production. If you know anything about the Hillman Imp, it's probably that it was built in its entirety in Scotland, specifically in a small town just on the outskirts of Glasgow called Linwood. But how exactly did an English company with most of their factories based in the Midlands end up setting their sights all the way on Linwood? Well, it was far from their first choice, to put it mildly. The Roots Group knew they didn't have the capability to add another model to their range without expanding their current factory network. This, as you would expect, led them to the decision of adding this capability to one of their existing factories, the Wrighton facility to be exact. Wrighton is a small town just outside Coventry, and was the headquarters of the Roots Group. It seemed like a perfect fit for this new project. But the government had other plans. When the Roots Group approached the government for planning permission to build this new wing of the Wrighton plant, they were turned down. Some sources claim that preparations at the site to host the Imp were already being made, and workers were told that the Imp was to be produced there. The planning permission was allegedly seen as just a formality. The government's motives behind this changed depending on who you ask, but the general consensus was that they wanted the Roots Group to make use of the IDC scheme. The Industrial Development Scheme, or IDC for short, was created by the government after the Second World War to encourage businesses to build new factories in what they called development areas. Development areas were part of the UK suffering from poverty, unemployment and a lack of industry. One of these development areas was Linwood. Linwood and Glasgow in general were struggling with mass unemployment as the once strong shipping industry was suffering quite severely. The shipping industry had created a job boom during World War II. However, the sudden drop in demand for ships at the end of the war and new international shipbuilders pulling away any leftover work caused widespread redundancy, with unemployment and poverty soon to follow. The IDC scheme was a carrot and stick situation, and for Roots it wasn't all stick. They received a juicy carrot in the form of £10 million in government grants. However, as Barry Massey, one of the employees sent to inspect the site, puts it, the location was far from ideal.
They were really bullied into it for political reasons. I went up to Scotland with another high-ranking officer of routes. We put in a report saying it's going to be uneconomic, everything will have to be carried up there. There's a workforce in Coventry. And we had lots of land at Brighton in Coventry. We had a factory in Coventry. We had all the suppliers round about. We said it will be a disaster. So Lesro and I nearly got fired.
Now, a quick side note I'd like to make here is I really don't like it when people say that Roots were forced into the move to Linwood. Sure, if they wanted to start production of their new project, they had pretty limited options, but one of those options was to scrap the project. This might sound outrageous, but that's exactly what happened with Little Jimmy. They also could have reworked one of their existing factories to fit in the Imp by cutting another model. Again, this sounds crazy, but their bigger cars just weren't selling due to the fuel shortages, so they didn't have a lot to lose by cutting one. My point is, they had options, and Linwood was the option Roots chose. So the decision was made, and Linwood was to be home to a brand new state-of-the-art factory. The project was absolutely massive. Despite personally visiting the site where the factory once stood, I'm still struggling to portray the scale of this place. So let's have a little tour around. First off is the administration offices, where the bureaucratic magic happens. As far as I'm aware, this is one of the only parts of the factory that's still standing today. It is also the building today called St. James's Business Centre, which I referred to in the intro of this video. It's also the entire reason I started looking into this story in the first place. Next we have the die casting plant, which was a self-contained unit, which cast the engines, gearboxes and a few other components. This was all cutting-edge technology at the time, and aluminium casting was a relatively new process in the automotive world. Onto the press steel company. Now this building is a bit different than the rest. It had been on that site before the rest of the factory, and technically it wasn't a part of the main factory. I'm pretty sure it wasn't even owned by the Roots Group. It built the shells for the Hillman Imp, painted them, and then did some minor assembly work to them. They did produce other car shells and panels however, some for the Roots Group like the Hillman Avenger, but also bodies for Rover and Volvo. Now onto the main parts of the factory, the machine shop and the assembly line. The machine shop is where the majority of the parts are assembled, such as the front and rear suspension, engine and the transmission. These components were then passed over a transport bridge in between the two buildings to the assembly line. The assembly line is where the final assembly of the Imps begins and ends. Basic shells start off at one end, and then after a quick visit to 41 workstations, running driving cars roll off the other end. To put the sheer scale of this place into perspective, on the site where the factory once was, there's now an Asda, which cutely enough has a little picture of a Hillman Imp by the entrance. This is not a small Asda, in fact it's probably the biggest Asda I've ever been in. However, compared to the factory, it is literally the same size as one department of one area of the factory. The point is, this place is huge. It wasn't just all scale and no substance either. The factory was packed with high-tech robots and a production line that would make Henry Ford blush. The whole factory really was cutting edge and was considered one of the most advanced automotive factories in the world at the time. Now, considering everything I just said, you would be forgiven for thinking that all the parts for the Imp were made in-house. Steel and aluminium go in, and an Imp rolls out the other end. That would be the ideal situation, but sadly, it was not the reality at all. Take the engines for example. They were cast in Linwood in the die casting plant, but they were not machined there. Machining of the parts took place in their Stoke plant in Coventry, a mere 300 miles away by train. That meant that these parts were cast in Linwood, then shipped to Stoke, then back again to be assembled onto the car. The gearboxes and a few other cast parts were also in the same boat, needing to be sent to Stoke for machining. This was a huge concern for Roots, as without these essential parts the production line would be forced to stop. To tackle these logistics problems, as I previously said, they employed the use of trains. The Linwood site was strategically located next to a railway, so that cars could roll off the production line and then get loaded onto massive car transporter trains. In fact, an entirely new type of train was created to hold all of these cars, called the Imp Special. The train was 1/4 of a mile long and consisted of 20 drive-on, drive-off car transporters, giving it the ability to carry 100 cars at a time. These transporters were just passenger carriages with the passenger compartment removed and replaced with a flat wooden platform. Not exactly the most high-tech thing in the world. But still, would you look at the size of that thing? This combined with the parts train coming back and forth meant that the train loading area was always kept busy. Sorry, I realise I've just gone on a big ramble about trains, and I'm drifting off topic again, but the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of money was invested into the Linwood site to ensure its success. That and the scale of this place was massive, and its potential was limitless. In 1961, construction of the factory began, and 2 years later, in May of 1963, it was completed, and the Hillman Imp was ready to be shipped out to dealerships all across the country, at least in theory.
To all things, there is a season, and man's labour has its season of pride when the long time of planning is over and his work is ready for the world to see. The great Roots development is celebrated with pride on its appointed day when His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh formally opens the Linwood factory. The Hillman Imp offers the pleasure of modern motoring to ordinary people all over the world. But to succeed, it must satisfy the exacting demands of all motorists. The Duke brings the experience and skill of an enthusiast to his interest in the new car. And for the true enthusiast, it isn't enough merely to look. Now they come, first in hundreds and then in thousands. The world is waiting for today's most advanced light car, and the Hillman Imp goes out to meet the world and win it.
Again, as I said earlier, the Roots Group's promotional footage is slightly biased on quite a few things, and although the clip that you just watched made it look like the whole thing went off without a hitch, the reality was quite different. Let's take a look at a slightly different point of view from the BBC's The Car is the Star, and see if we can spot any differences in the story.
HRH arrived, had a slap-up lunch and went away again. But what he didn't know was that the factory was half built and the silver imp he used to drive himself back to the airport was only one of a tiny handful of finished cars.
We had about 20 cars, and each trailer load took about 7. And so the cars were run through one door onto a trailer, and the trailer subsequently was driven out of the factory. A continuous stream of Hillman Imps left the factory on these trailers, but in fact, there were 20-odd cars and 3 trailers.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to declare this, whatever it is, open. Press the button.
This wasn't the end of the problems on opening day. According to Alan Lane, who helped set up the Linwood factory and was on site during the Duke of Edinburgh's visit, the production line stopped working due to an electrical fault, and someone had to hold 2 wires together to keep it running. As I said earlier, the main industry in the area before the Hillman factory opened was in shipbuilding. Funnily enough, shipbuilding and car building aren't that similar, but it's better than nothing, which is exactly the amount of experience some of the staff had.
I was a bus driver. Never seen a machine before. You know, you told lies to get in. You say, oh, I work machines.
Honestly, it seems like whoever was in charge of the operation had an ancient curse on them, as every step forward in the production process seemed to end in 2 steps back. The site was plagued with issues, and the new workforce was far from happy with their jobs. I'm going to get into the strikes and labour situation a lot more in a separate video, as I feel it deserves a deep dive, but this video is already going to be pretty long, so for now I'll just say there were a lot of strikes. The logistics situation was a nightmare as well, and caused problems where essential parts were lacking, which brought entire departments to a halt. Not only this, but even Mother Nature seemed angry at the factory, as in January 1968 a gale hit the facility and a 650 square foot area of roof was ripped off, damaging 340 imps in the process. Luckily no one was hurt. To compound on Roots' bad luck, the release of the imp was leaked to the press in 1962, a year before its official release. The publication got the name wrong, but other details were remarkably accurate. Regardless of the problems, the imps were being produced. Not in the numbers that management wanted, or even required to make the venture a financial success, but they were being produced. So the imps hit the street, and people loved them. Oh wait, sorry, I misspelled there. They hated them. The imps were proving to be incredibly unreliable, and had serious quality control issues. Some of the new groundbreaking technologies on the car, like the automatic choke and the pneumatic throttle I spoke about earlier, were extremely unreliable when faced with the harsh reality of British roads. These were quickly removed and replaced with more traditional parts for future models. Some extremely basic problems were also uncovered, such as the Imps had an awful habit of overheating in traffic, and the gearbox, a completely new design for Hillman, was proving to be horrifically unreliable. Somehow, an inexperienced workforce plus innovative design and technology does not equal a reliable product. Who knew? Reviews slated the new Hillman, and it could never quite shake off the reputation of being an unreliable mess, even in the years after when all the issues were ironed out. It took decades for the Imp to gain its beloved reputation of today as a sporty, simple little classic hatchback. But how could this be, I hear you ask? They did so much testing. They took it to Kenya and the bloody Arctic Circle, for God's sake. How could it be unreliable? Well, let's go back to that interview with Richard Lovey to try and figure out how it went wrong.
The cars just went flat out for several hours and then back again to the base, whereas the person buying the car for themselves would simply have gone out shopping in it and just done a few miles, maybe got the car half warm and then gone home in it, and that led to, I think, a lot of the overheating problems with distortion in the cylinder head and cylinder block.
I would say the car wasn't properly tested before it was released to the public. Prince Philip was opening the factory, and really the car wasn't really fully tested to go out on the road before the launch. If they'd given them another 5-6 months, all these modern features that were new on the Imp at the time, they could have been fully developed, and I don't think we would have had many problems at all. In fact, it would have been a world beater.
I also suspect the worldwide testing was in some ways a publicity stunt. Roots had done something similar with the Hillman Minx when they produced a short film called Hillman Non-Stop of the Hillman travelling 40,000 kilometres across Finland. It kind of makes sense that they would use all that promotional footage of the Imp cresting mountains in Italy and fording rivers in Kenya to dispel any worries about unreliability. Another thing that hampered the Imp is that, as I talked about in the first chapter of this video, the Imp was aimed at people suffering from the 1956 Suez Canal crisis and the fuel shortages that followed. That was the whole reason Project Apex was created. However, by the time the first Imps were rolling off the line in 1963, there were no fuel shortages. Sure, there was still a demand for economy cars, but the initial bubble had burst, and due to all the problems with the design and the factory, Roots were just way too late to the party. Compare this to the release of their main competitor, the Mini, which began development a year after the Imp, but somehow was still released as a production car 4 years before the Imp. Despite all the extra time invested in the Imp's development, somehow it still released as a worse product than the Mini. It didn't help that the Imp was priced at a premium to try and recoup some of the losses from the project, which only pushed more people towards the cheaper and arguably better Mini. Don't get me wrong here, I love the Imp, but back in 1963, if you were going to buy a brand new, small, sensible car for a family, would you go for the Mini or the more expensive, more unreliable option in the Imp? It was a no-brainer, and the sales figures reflected that. Another thing that went against the Imp was its rear engine design was outdated on release. In the 50s, a rear engine design was perfectly acceptable and almost seen as exotic, with mostly European cars sporting this design. For example, the iconic VW Beetle, the Type 2, the Alpine 110 and the Fiat 500. However, by the late 60s, the exotic nature of the rear engine had lost its charm, and what was left was a small awkward frunk and a high boot floor to lug your shopping into in the back. The front engine front-wheel drive design of the Mini just completely outclassed the Imp's design. One thing no one could criticise the Hillman for, however, was its performance. The handling and delivery of the horsepower from the high-revving 875cc engine were almost universally loved. In fact, the car soon became a favourite for racers across various motorsports. The two most famous examples of this were Rosemary Smith and Bill McGovern. We'll talk about Bill in a second, but for now let's focus on Rosemary. As she puts it, I have been driving international rallies for 5 years now, and for the past 4 years I have been with the Roots team as their regular contender for the ladies' prize. And actually I've won that in about a dozen international events now. I'm not really sure if that's meant to say price or prize, but that's what the source says, so there you go. Let's hear directly from the source what it was like to pilot a Hillman Imp in one of these rallies.
There were quite a few all-women's crews in those days, but there were very few, and Norman Garrett saw this, there were very few 6 foot tall, very young, very slight, sort of modelly looking blondes driving cars. And that's why he took me on originally. He thought this would be great for publicity, which it transpired it was. But he actually hadn't reckoned on the fact that maybe I could drive also. when we were at the top coming down, we could just virtually pass anything because it was so nippy and so manageable. It was very, you know, sure-footed. But when you got to the bottom and you had to start going up the far side again, because straight away the lack of power, that's when it came in. And you were just there and you go chug, 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 chug.
It wasn't just rally that the Imp excelled at. It fought well above its weight class in the British Saloon Car Championship, known today as the British Touring Car Championship, or BTTC. Bill McGovern propelled the Little Imp to 3 championship wins in 1970, 71 and 72, beating the likes of Ford Mustangs and Chevrolet Camaros. In an ITV documentary about the history of the BTTC, they spoke with Bill about his wins in the Imp.
I think the Hillman Imp was an amazing, iconic car. The car was so superior to anything else on the track. George Bevan used to build the engines on the kitchen table in his house. He was an absolutely brilliant engineer. 10,000 revs in every gear. The handling and the gearbox, the gear ratios, everything else was so advanced, so highly tuned that I wasn't doing a lot of dicing. I was going out there at a measured pace to amass the points.
Despite all this success in the racing world, the Imp still wasn't performing in the sales department. The Roots Group tried a technique known in the industry as badge engineering to increase sales. Badge engineering is where you try to sell basically the same car, but call it something different to make it seem exotic or sporty or whatever. I just want to very quickly run through all the various models that Roots released the Hillman Imp as so you can understand my point. There was the Hillman Super Imp, the Hillman Imp GT, the Hillman Californian, the Hillman Husky Estate, the Singer Chamois, the Singer Chamois Coupe, the Sunbeam Imp, the Sunbeam Imp Sport, the Sunbeam Chamois, the Sunbeam Stiletto, the Sunbeam Californian, the Sunbeam 900 and the Commer Imp. And to add to the confusion, there's the Hillman Imp Mark 1, Mark 2 and Mark 3. Add in all the variations on these names depending on which part of the world you're in, and you've got an even more confusing mess. And don't even get me started on the Lord and Lady special editions. I don't know what the marketing team were thinking with that one. The Lady Imp had a hairdryer and matching handbags, and the Lord Imp had a nautical theme complete with a compass, air horn and portable bar. They really don't make them like they used to. Now, to call all of what the Roots Group did as badge engineering is slightly unkind. There were some genuinely different models to come out, such as the Commer Imp, which is my personal favourite. However, the vast majority of their special editions and unique models appear to just be desperate cash grabs. Sadly, all this variation and badge engineering didn't really help get the Imps off the lot, and the sales figures kept tumbling. With problems even getting these things off the factory floor, and then the sales figures being less than impressive when they did, it came as no surprise when the Roots Group cut the Imp in 1976. I say the Roots Group here because I'm trying not to overcomplicate things, but it was actually Chrysler that pulled the plug. If you want to learn more about how Chrysler fit into this story, then keep your eye out for the next installment of this series. For now, let's talk about the legacy of the Hillman Imp.
They call this Tir Nanog, the land of the young in heart. A remote fairy tale land. It now offers its magic to the traveler. A new age in an old, old country. The small car is the symbol of this new revolution, the mobile revolution, and of the new freedom, the freedom of Mr. and Mrs. Everyman to delight in their heritage.
Despite what I said earlier about the Roots Group's promotional film being biased and inaccurate, I do genuinely love it. They just don't make commercials like this anymore. If you've enjoyed this video, I would highly recommend heading over to the National Library of Scotland's website to check out the full thing for yourself. I'll leave a link down in the description. It really is a great promo film, and you probably noticed I've used a lot of footage from this video. This isn't just because footage about this stuff is scarce, which it is, it's just a masterpiece of a promo. Anyway, to put it bluntly, history has been kind to the Hillman Imp, and you can see why. It was a relatively cheap, fun, sporty, if not slightly unreliable car. It was made for the classic car market. There are countless owners clubs and enthusiasts for these little machines all across the world. In fact, a lot of the source material I used to write this script is from enthusiast websites made and maintained by Imp fanatics. The Imp really has gathered a cult following over the years and has aged like a fine wine. Remember when I first introduced the Roots brothers? I mentioned that they exported cars worldwide. Well, that continued on throughout their time at the company. Up to 20% of the cars produced each year were exported to 73 different countries across the Imp's lifetime. I mention this because the thought of Imps still puttering around in Vietnam, Chile and Kenya makes me smile. The thought of the little town I used to live in just outside Glasgow having a legacy like that all across the world is a nice one, and probably a good one to end this video on. But of course this video isn't just about the Imp. The title literally says, The Incredible Story of Linwood and the Hillman Imp, but the Imp was just a part, if not a rather big part, of Linwood's story. And honestly, I find the second part of its story even more fascinating. I've hinted a few times over the course of this video at what that next video is going to cover, but I'm telling you there's so much more. For now though, that's all from me, but I hope to see you all again in the next part of this video, where we explore the lesser known years of Linwood's story. Thanks for watching.